Okay, so I think we can start now. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon from Texas and good evening for those who are joining us from the Netherlands. My name is Maria Alamo and I am the Deputy Representative of the Netherlands Business Support Office in Texas. On behalf of the NBSO, I want to thank you for joining us today in our 5th workshops from the series, The Secrets of Doing Business in Texas. Raising capital is one of the most difficult challenges for entrepreneurs and startups, especially when they want to expand or start a business abroad. That's why we organized this special workshop for you, where we'll review all the sources of financing and investment in the United States and Texas. And before I start, I would like you to remind you some particular and practical rules. This session is being recorded, so please maintain your microphone unmuted during the presentations. We will have a brief Q&A between each presentation and a more extended dialogue at the end. You can use the chat box anytime to leave your questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our great speakers and experts. Of course, some of you already know Willie. Willie Verbrugge is the Executive Vice President of Operations from SCORE Houston. He's also an entrepreneur and a former CEO of many big companies. Today, he will be our facilitator and first speaker. Arjan Dot is the Vice President and Relationship Manager of the International Department at Comerica Bank. He has more than 20 years of experience in the banking sector in the US, and he already has served several Dutch companies. Mark Nathan is the Vice President of Client Strategy for the law firm of Egan Nelson, and founder and publisher of the Texas Squared Agency and Startup Newsletter. He is an experienced business developer and an enthusiastic startup community connector. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. With that being said, we want to open the discussion with a very quick poll. And the question is, how familiar are you with the capital options for your business? The answers are completely anonymous, and we will give you some minutes to answer. Okay. I see some of you already answering. Okay. Ready? Here you can see the results of our poll. I see that many of you already have some knowledge, but you want to learn more. That's actually very good, because that's what we are going to do today. And in order to start, I will give you the floor to our first speaker, Willie. Willie, the floor is yours.
I'm ready. So for people who don't know what SCORE is an organization with 13,000 volunteers in the US. We are organized in 320 chapters in all the big cities. And of course, the biggest and best chapter is here in Houston, where with 160 volunteers, we help every year between 7,000 and 8,000 companies to start up. That means a lot of business plans, marketing plans, cash flow projections, and funding, sending to the banks or to the VCs or the PEs or the angel investors, and some of the other sources I'm going to talk to you just right now. So go ahead. The first source of finances for your business, especially if you start and you're small, is your own personal savings. When you go to the bank, they will always ask you to have some skin in the game. So you better be fluid before you start, otherwise it's going to be difficult to fund. Second source of financing is friends and family, people that you know, that trust you, that want to help you. You get, to some extent, for small businesses, you can extend your credit cards. I've seen people starting business with 4 or 5 credit cards, maxing them up in the beginning and then slowly paying them off. It's not a cheap way of doing it, but it can be done. If you have personal assets like a piece of land or a building, you can put them as collateral for some borrowing from the banks. That works also. And you can also bootstrapping, trying to survive as long as you can with the small little amount of coins that you have in your hand. So, but there are more interesting and more traditional sources of funding. Mariam, yep. Oops. The first one is bank loans, and Arjen will talk to you a little bit more about that. But we make a big difference between the big banks, the medium, small banks, the community banks, the credit unions. They have their role to play in different circumstances. Some of them prefer big amounts. Some of them are very risk averse. Some of them are very open to investments in the community that they serve. But everywhere in all these aspects, something coming together with the SBA guarantee makes a whole lot of difference. I'll explain a little bit SBA guarantee a little bit later what it means. The second group of people that we see most often involved are angel groups, angel investors, or networks of angels. They usually come together as groups and they listen to a couple of pitches. One says, yes, I'm interested. The second say, I join you. And by the time you're done around the table, you have $1 million or $1.2 million or $1.5 million to go and start your business. Venture capitalists are the next group that are very active, especially in Austin and in Houston. We have a lot of accelerators, incubators, and don't forget the corporate VCs. Large companies like Shell, BP, Chevron, or Schlumberger have their own corporate VCs, focusing on what they want to do with their corporation. But in general, venture capitalists are a very good source of funding. And they are very flexible. Sometimes it's pure equity, sometimes it's a combination of equity and loan, and sometimes it's loan depending on the situation of the company. And we can go a little bit more in detail, and Mark will explain to you a little bit more how it works. And then when your company is a little bit bigger and you're already making some profit, private equities are a very good source for serious funding. Family offices are also a very good source. For example, a member of the Texas Family Office Association, and we see some very interesting deals coming through on a regular basis. And then if you go even bigger, funds or sovereign funds are very important for things like infrastructure or bigger investments, breakthrough technologies or breakthrough market changes. What we've seen in the recent couple of years, special acquisition funds are used to roll up some industries to make very strategic acquisitions. And then you have the traditional IPO route, being on the stock market, the bond market, private placements. So there are plenty of other sources of traditional funding. But let's go to the next one. If you have an existing business, the best way you can fund yourself and your growth is to retain earnings. Most traditional, the least expensive, the ones in which you are the most in control, and you have more flexibility with timing than any other way. If you have short-term issues, line of credits or factoring of some of the contracts you have, is not a bad option. It's a little bit expensive, but it can help in the short term. What I see a lot is supply credits, especially for companies that start. A restaurant in the beginning might get some credit from its supplier on the food ingredients. Sometimes you have customers that are willing to advance you money if you develop something to solve their problems. For example, I had a company that had a special problem, and they gave us $500,000 to develop different features and functions to the pumps that we were delivering. And that customer basically paid for the development of that new type of pump. Another way of doing it is if you have projects, you get progressive payments during your project, 20% upfront, 20% after a certain milestone is achieved, and so on. That's a good way also to control your cash flow. And then once in a while, you have major customer partnerships where the customer is interested for you to develop a product, a service, or a solution to one of their problems. Then the traditional lines of credits or letters of credit for international business. And then everything that has to do with international import and export through the Export Bank or government export assistance and other means. So there are plenty of ways of getting funding for those specific activities. And Ariane will talk a little bit more about that. Okay, next one. Let me talk a little bit about the SBA, the Small Business Administration. It's a branch of the US government that was created some 60, 70 years ago. Because the US, if you look at the GDP of the US, 85 to 90% of the GDP of the US is created by small businesses. And that's why the government has created the SBA. The SBA itself does not give any loans. They give loan guarantees. And there are different types of loans. So basically, when you go to the SBA, you get your loan from a bank, but with a guarantee from the SBA. You take a loan for $100,000. For whatever reason, you go bankrupt. You lose whatever skin you put in the game. The bank only loses 10,000, and the government loses 90,000. So it reduces dramatically the risk of the banks, and that's why the banks are much more willing to loan you the money. There are something like 25 different programs at the SBA, and I'm only listing a couple of here. A 7A loan is mostly for working capital when you start your business until you get to the value of debt and you are in good shape. 504 loans are mostly based on assets and collateral. So if you need a warehouse or new building or whatever. Microloans are very small loans, like for example, a baker that needs to buy a new mixer or something like that. Export loans for equipments or projects, that is it's a pretty good source here, especially in Houston, because we are one of the biggest export cities in the US. Everything has to do with international loans or grants for trade assistance. If you want to go to the Messe in Düsseldorf, you can get a loan or a small little grant from the SBA. Go and do that. And then in case of disasters, like we had with the pandemic, PPP, IDL, but also disaster after flooding or after hurricane or those kinds, there are a lot of loans available at pretty good terms from the SBA and from the SBA partners. And then the SBA also gives express lines of credits through the banks again, but it's a pretty good way of helping in short term. And then there's a whole bunch of programs from the SBA and their banker affiliates also with for veterans, minorities, underserved communities, women, and other special groups. So if you're interested in any of those, make sure you check out the website of the SBA. It's pretty well done. You have a list there of some 25 different programs, or reach out to us at SCORE. We'll help you navigate those sources. Next one. And then there are a couple of alternative sources of funding that you might want to think about. Depending on when you are in the development of your company, there are some business grants, the National Science Foundation, SBAR grants. They're mostly focused on research. An SBAR grant can be, for example, it's in 3 phases usually. The first one, you can get $100,000 just to make sure that you round up your research and you can file your patent. The second one is to really build a pilot or prove your technology or show it off to bigger players that make sure that it is correct. And then the third phase is commercialization. And I've seen a couple of people doing that. It takes a little bit of time, but the results are usually pretty good. Next alternative source is crowdfunding. It's becoming very popular. There are plenty of websites and organizations that will do crowdfunding. Some are better than others. Some are more focused on B2B, some more focused on B2C. So do your research before you go that direction. But it can be a pretty good source, especially if you have a business that has social implications or environmental climate changes, application, or energy transformation, crowdfunding might be an interesting source. And then you have the whole issue of nonprofits. There are a lot of foundations and charities here in Texas, in the US, and worldwide that will help the nonprofits. But there are conditions attached to all that. So you have to be careful that you organize your profit in a business fashion, not just as a group of amateurs. There are also partnerships that do a lot of funding for organizations. Those are somewhere in between for-profit and non-profit. Some of these organizations can be, for example, a Chamber of Commerce or an API or an SBE or other organizations that are good organization networking sources for the industry and are and provide a service to the industry. And then in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of financial tech companies, online lenders coming from around the world. And the big advantage of those is that you can find them anywhere on the website. Just a piece of caution, do your homework, do your due diligence of these people, because we've seen a lot of scams in that field. We've seen a lot of very good ones also. But yeah, do your due diligence is too important to be taken by unscrupulous people. And then for some bigger projects, you can have international development banks, World Bank. I, for example, invested $1.8 billion in a potash mine in Congo-Brazzaville. And that was basically the World Bank, the Bank of African Development, the European Bank of Development, and the Asian Bank of Development. So you have to have those kind of big entities to make big projects like that. Next one. And then there are very creative sources of funding. Things that are not traditional, but I've seen through the history of what I've done at SCORE, peer-to-peer loans. I have, for example, 2 clients, both are IT software developers, developing apps. One company loaned $100,000 to the other company in 1 year, repaid in the second year, and the third year, the funds went $100,000 the other way, because the companies were developing new products at different stages in their lives and needed funds at different stages. And they worked similarly well together, and they were able to help each other with loans from one company to the other. And then you have barter agreements. 2 other companies in the same field. One was in a problem, they needed to hire more people or make more investments, so they needed the funds. And the other company had 2 or 3 engineers too much, didn't have enough job for them. So they gave the first company 3 engineers for 3 months, didn't pay them. And then 6 months later, 9 months later, the other company did the reverse. So that's what we call barter agreements. And those are fine. And if it's all a matter of understanding and working together in the industry. Then there are a couple of other things that are happening, trends that are getting more common. Agreements with banks or with VCs to repay your loan as you can. So you take, for example, loan originally for 3 years, and your business goes a little bit slower, but that's okay. You can repay it in 4, 5, 6 years. Or if you do better, you can pay it earlier. So those are flexible loan arrangements that I've seen with banks and with VCs also. And then another one that we've seen recently also is revenue-based loans. Basically, give you a loan for $1 million, and I'm going to take 10% of your revenue every month to repay your loan. The rest is yours. You do whatever you want with it. And that's not bad solution either, because then you have the flexibility to grow your business as quick as you want or as slow as you want, focusing more on quality than on quantity. So those are a whole bunch of different sources, and I call this presentation 40 plus sources because there are plenty more depending on what type of business you are and what you're looking at. Now let me talk a little bit about grants. And here, first thing I have to say about grants, there are in the US a lot of grants coming from a lot of different sources, but most of them have one criteria which is very important, is that you have to be a US citizen or at least a green card holder to have access to those grants. But There are grants at the federal government, at the small business development centers, at the level of the Texas state. There are health grants, there are research grants, there are research institutions that want to work together with companies. They get the grant, you get the profit of the grants. There's all the programs that we talked about a bit with the SBA. SBA does not only do loans, but also grants. Next one. More grants. National Science Foundation I mentioned earlier. Rural development grants. You can, for example, if you want to buy a farm or build a new warehouse on your farm, or buy yourself a tractor, there are plenty of very rural development, agriculture development grants. Homeland security. I have, for example, a client that is developing a training camp to train police academy and military in anti-terrorist preparedness. So he's getting a grant from the Homeland Security because the Homeland Security wants to make sure that those capabilities exist in different places in the country, prepare to train people in law enforcement. Then there are grants at the level of Texas, focused on what the state of Texas wants and how they are gearing the development of the industry and of the small businesses. And then there are a whole bunch of other ones like ID Cafe is a private organization that does a lot of grants on specific topics. They focus more on new ideas, new technologies that might not be commercial yet, but if they are developed correctly, will bring something in the next 3 to 5 years. There are companies like Amex, FedEx, Amazon, and others, and some of the banks also, that do special programs for veterans or for minorities or for women businesses. And all those are grants also. So there are plenty of availability of grants. Some of them are very small, $5,000 to $10,000. Some are as big as $5 million. So it's worthwhile looking into it. Some of the questions I get asked most often is, what are the best options for foreign companies? And that really depends on the type of business you are. If you're very heavily in assets, like I have, for example, a Dutch dredging company as a client, their assets are very important and very expensive. It's not too bad, it's not too difficult to get a loan for a bank, as long as this Dutch company has a subsidiary here, and that subsidiary is run by somebody who has a US passport or a green card, and the main person has at least 50% of the ownership of the subsidiary. So there are a couple of criteria attached to it, but it's usually not a big hurdle to get funding for that kind of thing. If it's a business that you want to start, which is more service-oriented, where there's no collateral, the banks are not always the best solution, because banks like to reduce the risk by having collateral as a second, as a backup solution, basically. So in that case, the VCs are more interested. VCs are less restricted by nationality. We have American VCs investing in Europe and European VCs investing here. So as long as the idea is good and the potential is good, and you can convince them with a good pitch that you know what you're doing and you have a good prospect of making a lot of money, they usually has a good source. Some of the other questions that we get a lot is, are there any specific requirements? In fact, there are very little, except the ones I mentioned earlier, in case of the banks and the nationality or the green card. The rest is a matter of building a good dossier, and that means business plans, marketing plans, cash flow projections. And then the banks and the VC are going to look at you and say, okay, who is this guy? What does he know about this business? Has he done this before? What's his character? What's his credit? And a whole bunch of those kind of considerations, but nothing fundamentally difficult. if you are a serious businessman and you know what you're doing. We see a lot of young enterprises that come and they just have an idea. They have no experience. They want to open a restaurant. They've never worked in a restaurant. Those kind of entrepreneurs have difficulty finding funding, and it's normal because most institutions would not think that they know what they are doing and will not take the risk to fund them. So we'll have more questions at the end, but in the meantime, Maria, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Willie. That was a very complete and informative presentation. And remember that we are going to send you all this information by email, so don't be afraid you didn't take notes at this point. Now I would like to give you the floor to our next speaker, Aryan. Aryan, welcome to the stage.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm a relationship manager at Comerica Bank in the International Finance Department. I actually grew up in the Netherlands, so I also speak fluent Dutch as well. But I came here for my studies, and Comerica Bank was one of those banks that had an international division that works with a lot of EU companies. And in particular, for my case, it was the Dutch-speaking countries. So I focus on particularly the Netherlands and Belgium, of course. And so as a result of that, I have over 20 years of experience working with a lot of different Dutch companies and their different circumstances as to how to do banking here in the United States. And so, you know, always the first question by all the Dutch entrepreneurs is, why is banking in the US so weird, so foreign, so different? Is there any logic to what you bankers in the US are doing? And so it's more like they're established here for the established companies. And so depending on also the foreign policies, because we just went through a few administrations, the banks kind of adjust to some of those administrations. And so as a result of that, they will look at, okay, what's the risk from a background profile? And so as a result of that, the US make it very different every time. But in my presentation, wanted to go over what the differences are with the US and EU, the type of lending tools that you can expect from a typical bank. A little bit about pricing. Of course, pricing is very fluid, but I'll give you a little bit of details about that, and then some examples of financing that we've done. And then at the very end, kind of considerations, some of the things that I advise entrepreneurs to keep in mind as they are talking to their bankers or looking out for what's the next step, how should they approach one, etc. So with that, I'll go into differences between US and EU. So one of the things obviously is that what I face also is that, you know, obviously whenever you come to the US bank, you've already had a relationship with your Dutch bank. And so coming to the US, you're kind of new. So as a result of that, because of the jurisdiction between the Netherlands and the United States, banks cannot base anything off of your history. So then a US bank will look at you and kind of try to determine under US jurisdiction what they can do. And so as a result of that, typically you don't have much to go on. And so it makes it a little bit harder as a new entrepreneur in the United States. Also, the US banks, this is the complaint I get from pretty much every, because we'll work with French companies, Italian companies, German companies. And the biggest thing about the difference between the European Union and the US banks are they will notice that the US banks are very, very traditional. I call it traditional, of course. A lot of my friends would basically say a very conservative approach that we have in comparison to what the European banks would do. And then in addition to that, the US banks also have a much higher due diligence requirement. Ever since 2008 happened, and 2001 in particular, it started with 2001, but 2008 was another hit. All of a sudden, all the rules changed by the Federal Reserve Bank, which is the equivalent to the ECB bank for the American banks. And so the Federal Reserve Bank is the one that tells us what we can do, what we can't do, what are the regulations, and how we have to abide by it. And so that made a huge difference in terms of why foreign ownership has completely changed into how the U.S. looks at the world. So in 2001 and before, the U.S. was very open. You could go into any institution and easily open up accounts, but since then, even on U.S. companies, it's become a little bit more difficult. And so, but there's still ways to get around it. It's just there's a longer process. And then, of course, the other big difference is whenever I start doing a loan for some of the Dutch companies, they always ask me, wow, you came up with this many documents for me to sign. Whereas, in the EU, there's maybe like 10, 20 pages that you have to sign to get into a loan documentation. And most of that is because there's a lot more defined legal laws in the Netherlands and in the European Union versus the US. In the US, it is completely up to the bank and its definitions. And so as a result of that, whenever you get documentation from banks here in the United States, everything is defined. And so as a result of that, there's a lot more legal costs involved with it and attorneys that get involved. So just one of the things I also always recommend is make sure that you don't want to go and crazy on the negotiations and find an expensive attorney. But at some point, if you go into lending, you might want to make sure that you have somebody you trust and work with that person. And because what we typically see is there's a lot of questions that come back and it makes it go much longer in terms of getting the closing done. Also another big difference is factoring in the US with the US banks is very unpopular. So it's a very normal thing with a lot of the European banks. But the US banks kind of shy away from using that particular tool. And the reason being is that, again, it goes back to the laws in the United States and there's nothing defined. And as a result of nothing being defined, it is up to that US bank to make sure that everything is in that legal document for a recourse basis. And so as a result of that, typically factoring is done by what we call financial institutions, which are not banks. They are basically still financial structures, but they'll take on a lot more risk than what a regular regulatory bank would do in the United States. So like, for instance, Goldman Sachs is a little bit more on the more higher spectrum of taking risk. It's banks of that sort that will look into those kinds of opportunities versus your regular B of A, Comerica, JP Morgan Chase. They'll occasionally have a factoring facility, but for the most part, they want to do the typical traditional type of financing, which I'll describe a little bit later of what that kind of looks like. The other big difference is, of course, from a pricing perspective, is that in the EU, they follow the Euribor. In the US, it's the LIBOR. And so typically, whenever you get quoted a price, it's typically here in the United States LIBOR. And as you might know, LIBOR is positive 0.1% right now. It goes up and down, of course, with the treasuries. But whereas the Euribor, I believe, is at 0.53, negative 0.53. So, of course, the European banks now put floors in place, but essentially it makes for the Europeans cheaper financing than in the United States. And what I always like to tell my Dutch clients is we still use checks in the United States. It's a little embarrassing, I'll admit that, but what's funny is there's actually a whole lot of technology that goes around checks. And so it's not just somebody writes a check and give it to somebody else. There's more that goes with it. But essentially, with the business to business in the United States, we still see 60% of business with checks. So just keep that in mind as well as you start doing things here. Something to bring up to your banker and kind of know whether your banker has some solutions for the checks. Of course, we do a lot of things electronically these days, but again, it's a question, and I'll bring it up in the recommendation as well of what you can do. And then the last thing is the negative balances. A lot of times we see that, you have overdraft facilities in Europe, And so depending, of course, with your relation with your bank, that's fine. But actually here in the United States, it's considered actually a very negative thing. And one of the points that Willie brought up was supply side financing. So we're reaching out to your suppliers to get some credit from them. One of the things suppliers will ask is, have you ever had a negative balance with your US bank? Just keep in mind that is one of the things you can't do, and something that if a supplier asks us for that information, that is something we would supply to them. And so typically it has a negative impact to you trying to negotiate for a line with that particular supplier. So then what are the types of lending tools? So the most popular, of course, everybody I'm sure is probably familiar with these types of financing. There is a lot more than this, but these are the typical type of financing that you'll see that banks will typically push you towards. This is our box essentially, but the most popular, of course, being the working capital lines. That's basically like having a credit card, and you can go and do different things with your working capital lines. We typically allow for general corporate purposes to be used with your working capital line. So typically that's the one that people go for. The next one is your term loans. Term loans are typically for your big equipment or equipment in general. That's what you want to tell your banker that you want a term loan, and they'll ask you for depreciation and some other items to kind of determine what that term loan would look like. Mortgages is something banks really like to do here in the United States. So that's a very popular one. Acquisition loans happen as well. It's not as popular just because of typically bankers will ask, what is your experience in that field? But it's something we see a lot. And then, of course, another popular one is leasing. With leasing, I'll go into some better options than talking to your banks, but it's something the banks can offer as well. So then on the next page, so going into the structures, going back to that working capital line, what could that look like? What are typically the things that the banks will do? You got, of course, your really large companies that are investment grade. And so under investment grade type companies, typically they'll create lines of credits with the major banks, and then they typically have a syndication. And then what they have to do is make sure they keep an investment grade and certain covenants to keep that line of credit in place. Of course, Rabobank and ING are very popular with putting those structures in place, and then they typically bring in a lot of other banks to help those large companies. One recommendation there is, if you're in this category and you do have U.S. operations here, to consider in your bank group to have some U.S. banks. The reason why I typically bring it up and talk to ING and Rabobank about that is because whenever you have the U.S. banks joining, you have operations here. Typically, those banks can very easily support those operations here as well and provide you some of the special type of financing that would be required from here. But then, of course, what are the real typical facilities? And that's what we call asset-based facilities. Asset-based facilities are the ones that, where Willie mentioned earlier, collateral. Well, one of the big differences between here and Europe is it's technically a hybrid the way the U.S. banks look at it. The U.S. banks want to have some kind of collateral, but they also want to know that from a cash flow perspective that you're able to pay the loan. So normally it's to pay the interest. Can you cover the interest with your EBITDA? One of the most important ones. But essentially, the biggest one that we see is the 100% advance on letters of credit from the Dutch banks. The Dutch banks basically have things such as standby letters of credit that they would then provide to a U.S. bank, and then that subsidiary immediately gets 100% of financing because of the credit structure of a Rabobank and ING or ABN. So those are things I highly recommend. And the way it works is if you have a line of credit in the Netherlands with one of your banks, typically you have a sublimit for letters of credit, or you can ask for a sublimit of letters of credit, and then basically go to your Dutch bank and say, hey, listen, who do you work with in the United States? And can you give a letter of credit to that facility for your subsidiary? And American banks typically are very responsive to that. Most of your major banks will have something in place. But then if you don't want to pursue that route, what are the other ways? Well, the most used route is an advance on accounts receivables and advance on inventory. And then they combine that together and provide you with a line of credit. It's a lot like factoring, except factoring has a recourse to that accounts receivable, whereas this is still recourse to the borrower and not exactly to the accounts receivable, because again, factoring is not popular here because the laws are not in place to easily pursue that circumstance. So again, whenever you talk to your American banks, it's a hybrid. So whenever, because a lot of times we get people saying, hey, here's collateral, finance this collateral. And typically it's like, no, what does it look like from a cash flow perspective? Because we don't want to end up with the collateral and liquidate the collateral if you can't cover the interest. But the good thing is a lot of banks are also comfortable with taking a guarantee from the parent company. So if the parent company is profitable and there's no limitations with the Dutch bank on the parent company, some of the banks will take that instead to support the subsidiary. So then on the next page, you have your equipment financing. Real quickly on the equipment financing, again, cash flow is key, but then a lot of banks will give you 70 to 90% on new equipment and 70 to 80% on appraised value of used equipment. Just keep in mind that appraised value, because essentially what that means is somebody has to get involved, a third party, to look at that equipment. But whereas new equipment, typically that's leased pretty quickly. This is also where I want to mention that manufacturers are actually our biggest competitor in this arena. So therefore, a lot of times approach your manufacturer first. They are typically very aggressive here in the United States, more so than the banks. Not to give away business from the banks, but manufacturers are doing a good job here. So talk to them first, and otherwise find a banker to look at that. Mortgages, big business for the banks here. Something banks really like to do. So if you have already operations here and you see that the leasing is a bit on the expensive side, or what I typically tell clients is you might not need real estate, but for the future, it's always good to have, because you can cash out a mortgage. What a cash out means is you already have a mortgage, you start paying it down, you pay down $500,000. 3 years down the road, you need that $500,000. Well, go to the bank and say, I want to cash out, refinance. Essentially what that means is the $500,000, and that's something quickly the banks can give to you. So in mortgage here in the United States, what we typically see is real estate keeps rising quite nicely. So banks really love that business, something to look into. And then lastly, the acquisition loan. On the acquisition loan, that's typically where banks to look at the track record first of whenever you want to acquire. But obviously, the quickest way to make things move quickly here in the United States is making the acquisition loan, because that way you have the employees you need, you have already some of the business, and of course there's already collateral with it. So this is something we do recommend if you have some experience with it, and work with a banker that can take a guarantee from the Netherlands as well, or work with the Netherlands to make sure that you get that acquisition loan. But another something we recommend. So then on the following page, this is examples, and I'll quickly go through the examples. But whenever you go to the U.S. banks, they'll basically categorize you into one of these three segments. They'll, either call you a large corporate type client, and that's where you have global revenues of $500 million and more. Typically, you want to go with a syndicated credit facility. That essentially means you get a group of banks together, and normally it's ING and Rabobank are pretty good at, ABN of course as well, that can put those together, and then they just essentially look at the public credit ratings. We do see some subsidiaries create their own credit facilities here, and that works really well as well, and something that the United States likes a lot. But probably the majority of the companies we see are more in the middle market and business banking. Business banking is the small business type lending. In the middle market category, that's typically where you do the asset-based lending because you probably have some cash flow at that point in time, either here in the United States or at the parent. So then you first want to make sure that you have the most important covenants are interest coverage ratio, meaning with EBITDA, you can easily pay your interest, and debt to EBITDA. That debt to EBITDA, the US banks are typically in the 2 to 3 times. So that what that means is that the debt that you raise is not more than 2 or 3 times your EBITDA. That's a key covenant that American banks look at. And then on the third category, the business banking lending, that's typically the companies that are $5 million or less in revenues on a global basis. Typically, the banks here like to see larger than that, and therefore what I typically advise the clients is look at the Dutch parent company, at the home base and see if there's a sublimit under that to basically provide a guarantee from the bank to here to provide that support. So then on the next page, we'll talk a little bit about pricing. Pricing, again, is very fluid here. We do get something, if it's of interest to anybody. We at Comerica Bank, we have an investment bank that provides us with kind of standard pricing in the market and kind of what that looks like. So if there's ever anyone that's interested to look at that, it's 20 pages of information, but essentially it provides some clarity about that. And I can provide that of what it looked like back last year, what it looked like in April, what it looked like in March, what it looked like in February. It changes quite a bit. But essentially, the bank guarantees are an easy one to look at, and typically what the banks offer here to those guarantees is LIBOR plus 1.5% to 2.25%, depending on which Dutch bank is providing it and what the circumstances are. And again, LIBOR is 0.1%, so you're looking at 1.6% to 2.35% as a financing if you provide a bank guarantee from the Netherlands. One of the things you can also look at as well as, and that's what we bankers do almost every day, is the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal will provide what the LIBOR rating is or what the 30-day is. And back on April 1st, it was 11 basis points, so 0.11% or 0.11% for the Dutch. Here in the United States, we go with point system instead of the comma system. So anyway, that's why you see the 1.5 and the 2.25 here. But Wall Street Journal, and looking at something that I can provide you, then you can see kind of what the pricing looks like. But essentially, if I had to, looking from experience, normally the U.S. banks, unfortunately for me, but U.S. banks are typically 0.75 to 2% more expensive than the European banks. So then on the next page, the considerations for your banks here in the United States. And so one of the biggest things is having a relationship with a corporate banker. Make sure that you talk to a banker that is very experienced with European companies. All too often, Europeans come here and they see the first bank branch on a corner, and they go into the branch and set things up, but then find out that that branch cannot do almost anything for the entity. So whenever you're looking at a banker, ING, ABN, and ABO all have their banks that they refer things to. Typically it's JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo or B of A, which are all fine banks, but I've noticed too often that they also send it to the branches instead of a corporate banker. So whenever you talk to somebody, make sure it's a corporate banker, because a corporate bank can make decisions. And stay in touch with the corporate banker. All too often they don't. We all have a lot of things going on, but if you're not in touch with the corporate banker and then you ask for something, all too often I've seen negative responses as a result of that. And so by having a relationship and knowing them, you typically get better results out of them. And then most importantly, and this is what I get all the time, here in the United States, people think that, people actually get credit scores. And they think that companies get credit scores as well. And what a credit score means is that you have a social security number, tax ID here with the IRS, which is the tax code. And they track that. And you can see on an individual what that looks like. But it's not for businesses. You can go to Dun and Bradstreet and create something, but you're paying for it and nobody trusts that. So don't take that anyway, my recommendation is don't take it into consideration, because we as banks, we never look at that. We don't care about that. We essentially go to the financial statements and work with the financial statements and collateral. So if somebody says, oh, I'll create a credit score for your company, just know that that individual maybe ask more questions, but essentially it doesn't exist. It exists for people. And so that's why number 7, keep your financial statements up to date and use reputable accounting firms that do a good job for you. We have several that we work with. Obviously, in the Netherlands, the most popular ones are the 4 largest ones, but essentially just make sure you work with a good accounting firm. And that's it in a nutshell. Essentially, there's a lot more I can talk about, but obviously feel free to reach out anytime if you have more questions after this session if you don't ask them today.
Thank you very much, Arjen. That was a very, very complete and educational presentation, actually. Willy, do we have any questions for Arjen? I think you are on mute.
Yeah, that should be better. Arjen, can you explain a little bit the opportunity for export from the US for foreign subsidiaries with the support of EXIM?
Yes, so that's a very popular program. The XM facility is what we bankers call it. The XM facility means that essentially, again, that's an SBA program. SBA normally requires an American involved for most of the other stuff. So an entity has to be 51% owned essentially for most of the SBA products. But this is the one product SBA doesn't care. The thing that SBA cares about is that the content of the product, at least more than 50% of that product is manufactured in the United States. And so what we see is a lot of European companies, they have certain things that they want to buy here and send back to Europe or sell maybe abroad. This is a product that basically SBA will guarantee to a bank, and so therefore a bank is more comfortable to provide that lending. And so again, it's a product that you're buying from the United States that you're exporting out of the United States, and more than 50% of the value of that product has to be manufactured in the United States. It's a good product.
Arjen, Corona has made it difficult for people to travel, and I've seen a lot of questions recently about foreign companies. Can they open bank accounts here online, or do they physically have to be here?
It unfortunately depends on which bank you're talking to, and the majority of the banks here still say that you have to physically meet in person. And so technically what they will say is, okay, hire somebody you trust, and then through that you hire that person and you have that person basically go to the bank. There's very few banks, we're one of them, but very few banks that will actually open up a bank account, not online. You still have to talk to a corporate banker, but essentially there's a few banks that, as long as you have a good relationship with ING, Rabobank, ABN, something that we bankers can talk to, or with a CPA firm. There's a couple CPA firms we work with. If they make or say, yes, I vouch for that company, there's a few banks that will open up that bank account without the Dutch person being here physically. There are some banks that can do that, open up an account while they're in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Arjen. I think we have a question from Michael Doe.
Yeah, hi, Maria. Hi, everyone. Michael Doyce here. got a question on building your credit in the US, because rightfully so, you said not a company has a credit score, it's the person. But if a Dutch founder moves to the US, how does the Dutch founder can build up this credit score? Because you get into a catch-22, right? There's no credit history. So how do you build up that credits? Because really, in Europe, we don't really care about that, right?
Yeah.
If there's money in the bank, that's enough. But here in the US, it's really like you got to have a credit score. So any tips and tricks and how you as a bank do that? Do you issue, for example, credit cards to Dutch founders that want to open a bank account?
That is a great question. So, and something we see few answers here. There's one institution William and I both know very well that is a credit union, and they basically will help out with those expats to open up a credit card. There are few banks that will also give you a credit card as long as they have the business as a client. So Comerica is one of them, BBVA is one of them. Well, actually, it's going to be PNC. They just acquired. But anyway, as long as the business has a relationship with the bank, oftentimes banks would be also okay with giving like in our case, we give a 5,000 credit card to the employees of that company that are expats. And essentially what that does is it quickly helps that expat get something established. And the way the United States looks at it is you need 18 months of looking at a decent credit line with somebody. And as long as you have that 18 months, and there's some tricks of what you need to do as well. And, if it's of interest, we can talk about it later because it can be a long conversation. But essentially, with 5,000, in 18 months, you quickly get the credit score that then after 18 months, a lot of institutions will then provide you with financing. But there's a few options. If you want to know who they are, we can certainly help.
Okay, let's take that offline. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Arjan. If there is no more questions at this moment, and in order to respect our time, I want to move on to our next speaker. Mark, please go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, I was waiting for everybody to settle down. No, I'm kidding. I was on mute. Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for having me today, Maria specifically for inviting me to speak today. I see a handful of people in the chat room as friends of mine, so I'm very happy to see them. And I really want to talk today very quickly about the specific investor landscape in Texas. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me while we just kind of go over Texas itself. I work for a startup-focused law firm based in Austin, but offices all over the country. And my entire world has been actively involved with the startup community, both in Houston, now Austin, and really across Texas. So couple things that a lot of people don't know about Texas. It is an enormous state with an enormous amount of opportunity. But the one thing that I think is really critical is right in the middle. 6 of our largest metropolitan areas in the United States reside within Texas, within about 5 hours of driving between each other. That's Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. And a lot of people don't recognize the fact that Austin itself is the 11th largest city in the United States. Most people consider it a very small town, but it's growing like crazy like every place else in Texas. Next slide, please. So the 2 things that we really touched on already really fall into 2 separate buckets: debt financing and equity financing. And the reason I bring them up today in this particular part of the talk is because I want to give some parameters around what is appropriate and what numbers look like here in Texas. Generally, for the first $1 million raised in Texas for a new startup, you're looking at a convertible note, and sometimes this happens to be a safe note if you're familiar with that. But ultimately, the general rules are most Texans don't really give valuations higher than $5 million on a pre-money or pre-seed round. They typically like to have a 20% discount to the note itself for future funding coming in, and interest rates, obviously not in a safe note, typically hover between 6 to 8%, although interest rate is not why most investors are investing in your startup company or technology company. On the flip side, on the equity side, generally VCs in Texas, and we're going to get into the weeds on who the VCs are and what they're looking for, they are typically raising or writing checks in the $3 to $5 million range Most VCs will not write a check in Texas for less than $3 million. It's simply not worth their time. There are a number of pre-seed and smaller investors that will do anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million, but in general, the bona fide standardized VCs in town are typically looking at averages around $4.9 million. That's the general average for 2020, which was slightly up from the year before, 2019. Obviously a bit of a surprise during a pandemic year, but I think everybody on this phone call will understand that people who are still in business are more busy than they ever been, even during the regular years. One thing that I should mention, and this is really critical, in order to speak to a venture capitalist in Texas, your minimum monthly recurring revenue on a SaaS product should be about $30,000. Every VC I know says generally the same thing. Unless there's an extenuating circumstance of why your monthly revenue is not in the $30,000 or above range, it's probably not worth a conversation with a VC if you're actually seeking investment. Now, to start a conversation, to have the initial conversation with an investor, absolutely talk to them anytime you like. But in general, most investors I know are putting that $5 million to work on deals that are minimum 30,000. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, and Willie certainly touched on this and went into a lot more depth than I did. I'm just going to specifically talk about some of the numbers around the amounts funding for some early stage companies. So as Willie mentioned earlier today, the best kind of start is really bootstrapping, and Texas itself is very, very keen on getting your company to the point where it's revenue and income positive so that you actually don't need to go out and raise money. Now, obviously that's a very rare situation. We certainly prefer bootstrapping companies, but if you can't bootstrap, then the first two items you go to are typically your own personal needs, which is either credit cards, as we mentioned, or your actual customers. The actual prepaying of customers is, once again, bootstrapping is really a very time-honored and very respected way of generating income for your early stage startup. After that, there's all kinds of incubators and accelerators and grants and prize packages, and those prizes can be pretty sizable. At Rice University, who many in Houston are very familiar with, they have a business plan competition, which is the largest in the world, and they typically give anywhere from $1.5 to $2 million of real cash to early stage companies. Many years ago, I had a very good friend who was actually my intern when I worked for the Houston Technology Center, who was a Rice graduate, found a technology at Rice, went through the business plan competition, and walked away with about $460,000 from that competition alone. That meant they didn't have to give up a single shred of shares or stock, and it was all non-recourse grant money, and that was their seed funding to ultimately raise another $16 million and sell for about $60 million. So grant and prize money are not to be overlooked because the money really could be significant. After that, and we touched on this earlier, friends, family, and fools, these are people that you know or are close to you. In Texas, those checks are typically around the $25,000 to $100,000 range individually. That will turn into hopefully anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 for those kinds of monies you need to get your company started in a revenue generating perspective. Obviously, we talked about angel networks and private venture firms, and we'll get into those, but I just want to touch on the fact that most angels and angel networks are typically giving you capital in the $500,000 to $1 million range. And once again, the VCs are starting with the Series A at $3 million, but the average is about $4.95 million. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a non-comprehensive map of all the activities in the incubator accelerator space here in Texas. Many of these are concentrated in Austin, several of them in Houston. This is by no means comprehensive. There are lots and lots of other organizations. Before we got on this call, we were talking about another one called Green Tech, specifically, or Greentown Labs, that's going to be launching next week, that's focused specifically on clean tech. We have obviously different organizations in different areas. Austin tends to focus early stage on early stage business to business software. Houston is deep tech, that includes oil and gas, anything that has to do with any kind of technical or in the field operations for oil and gas is obviously something we do in Houston very, very well. Dallas, surprisingly, has quite a bit of activity in the healthcare space led by Health Tech Wildcatters, whereas Houston has another health tech group that everybody seems to know because it really is a world-class organization called TNCX, which is a organization founded by the 22 separate hospital systems in the Texas Medical Center. In San Antonio, you have Geekdom and Realco. We have certain specialties. One that I'm particularly interested in myself is in the consumer packaged goods space, which is very different from the technology software space. But SKU and naturally Austin are programs in the Austin area that have really built an international presence when it comes to bringing in and focusing on later stage consumer packaged goods deals. Next slide, please. Thank you, Maria. Here are some of the angel networks we have in Texas, and I've named a number of them under the umbrella of the Alliance of Texas Angel Networks. There are actually 13 separate angel groups. The most important fact about angels in the United States, in Texas specifically, is that CTAN, the Central Texas Angel Network, which is based in Austin, and HAN, the Houston Angel Network, where I was a member for 8 years myself, and I'm still very close with them, they are considered to be the first and second most active single city angel networks in the United States. Houston Angel Network has had an incredible run of a number of different great companies, and they're hovering around anywhere from $5 to $6 million invested, along with a sidecar fund called the Texas Halo Fund, which will be closing its third round in the next couple of weeks. A few of these others are specialty groups. Beam is one specifically for women. SWAN is the Southwest Angel Network, which is specifically focused on impact investment. Urban Capital Network, also based in Houston, is for minority groups. BAMA is also the same. Business Angel Minority Association is the acronym for BAMA. And BKC is one in the Bernie County, which is directly north of San Antonio, a very small town, but attracting a number of different angels and building an angel network that's very formidable. Next slide, please. Thank you, Maria. Just a bit of news that happened just 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now. Essentially, VCs are moving here in droves. There's activity here that nobody's ever seen, but the real money is flowing into Texas and Texas-oriented deals. So having a Texas-focused deal simply means having a presence here. That could mean having a sales office here, an engineering headquarters here. Even just a small office at any one of our co-working spaces across Texas would qualify most of the private VCs to say that you are a Texas-based fund, and then would qualify to actually get investments from them. Next slide, please. These are just a handful of some of the larger names in the VC space. There's essentially 5 major VC firms in Texas. Most of them are spinoffs of a much larger firm that broke up called Austin Ventures. Don't have to go into the history of it, but we actually have now several funds in the $100 to $200 million space. Live Oak, Silverton, Next Coast, S3 are all on there. Elsewhere Partners also came out of Austin Ventures. In Houston, I don't think anybody that's been in the venture space for more than 5 minutes would overlook Mercury Fund, who is the largest tech-focused fund in the Houston area, and they are investing all across what they call the mid-continent, anything that's not on either the West or the East Coast. And they're particularly nice guys to boot, which helps. Many of these funds that I'm showing you are also specialty funds. Handful are in the healthcare space. Some are in the consumer packaged goods space. I'll specifically mention CAVU, C-A-V-U. It is considered to be the largest consumer packaged goods fund in the United States right now. Next slide, please. Thank you. And once again, we're not going to make you take notes. I'm sure this will be available to all the people here. These are some resources that I've put together over the years of Facebook groups, email newsletters, one I write myself called the Texas Square newsletter, which I'm very proud of, and a few of the co-working maps, which will help you land a little bit easier. Next slide, please. That's it. We're ready for questions, but I'm very easy to get a hold of. I'm always happy to talk to companies that are coming from the Netherlands to the United States, specifically Texas. My real focus is on fundraising and legal services for my background as a business development director for a law firm here in Austin. So thank you very much. I'm ready for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mark.
I told you I'd be quick.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very quick and very complete presentation about the Texas investment landscape. And Willie, I wonder if we have already some questions for Mark.
Yeah, let's start with this one. If you look at entrepreneurs going to VCs and getting rejected, what are the 3 most important common issues why they are rejected?
Why do they get a no?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a softball question for me. That's a very easy one. Thank you for this. This is easy. Number one, first and foremost, the company is not generating enough revenue or doesn't have the path to clear out enough revenue. So you have to understand, VCs are in the risk management business and they are looking for very specific returns. So the number one issue is the company can't generate enough capital that even with the VC investment would make sense for them to take a piece of this. Number two, and this is true across the board at every stage of VC, the team itself is not the type of team that the VCs have been successful with in the past. Therefore, the human element is there, and therefore they're not going to get a yes to certain types. So there is a very strong bias to a certain pattern of successful entrepreneur. So that's the number two. The number three, and this is less so now because I think things are fragmenting, but the total addressable market for the client base of the startup is not big enough for the company to actually get investment. If your market is a very niche market, if you're less than $100 million of actual capital that you could capture, it's probably not a VC style investment, at least here in Texas.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, in terms of industry or sectors, is there a preference on the part of the VCs? Let's say more in the IT or in technology or consumer? What is there a trend? Is there
absolutely
preference?
Certainly, at least here in Texas and specifically in Austin, one of the things that I can tell you is that Austin thrives on business to business software as a service type businesses. We are extraordinarily good at software sales. It's something that we're very good at, as well as customer service. So if you're involved with customer service or sales and you've got a software as a service selling B2B that's doing more than $30,000 a month, it would become relatively easy for you to raise capital here. Outside of that, consumer is not something that Texas is very good at, although we had some major exits in the consumer space. We're very, very good at anything that supports the main industries of Texas, specifically oil and gas and medical. So if you have a medical device, medical software that supports the healthcare space, that's usually done very, very well here. And there's enough money here for it to make sense to be here in the United States, specifically Texas. A couple of other things that we do, obviously anything that supports taking any kind of resources out of the ground in the energy space, and also alternative energy. So we know everything there is to know about gas and trading and the software behind it and all the ancillary organizations that take the energy business and turn it into an actual money-making business.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I think we have another question from Amal.
Aman, pleasure.
There we go. Thanks, Mark, for a very brief and effective presentation, actually.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what's your take on how VCs in Texas are looking at investing in European landscape? Is there a trend going towards that?
It's not easy, unfortunately, and I am being very blunt here, and I hate to say this because it is true. Most Texas-based VCs really are very parochial. They really do want to invest, as per their charter, in investments in the Texas area. So in order for investments to go overseas, there's very likely a chance you'll have to incorporate in the United States and have at least a token office in the Austin or Texas area. It's not impossible, it's just not the most likely thing.
To follow up on that, Mark, would a VC approached by a European company who has a subsidiary here, would the VC accept equity in the European company, in the mother company?
Not here in Austin or Texas. Very likely they would ask to have a new incorporation in the United States, specifically a Delaware C Corp, that the VCs can invest in. Now, the IP and the ownership and all of the management could absolutely be in Europe without any problem. But from a mechanical standpoint, the investment has to be made in the United States. In general, there's always exceptions, but that's generally the rule.
Okay.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Of course.
There is any other questions for Mark or for the rest of the speakers? You can raise your hand or just leave it in the chat.
I can't believe this. We've been so clear.
I have a question. Clean tech. I didn't hear that. I hear oil, gas, and energy, but clean tech and CO2 reduction.
It's 100 times more important in Europe than in the US. First, there is a trend, and for example, Greentown Labs that just is opening next week here in Houston is focused on energy transition and on climate change and CO2 and so on. But what we see is that most of the big investments here are done by the corporate VCs.
Specifically
Shells,
Chevron
the
and
BPs.
Chevron, 100%
Yep.
correct. But they
Who
are
wants-
focused on carbon sequestration.
Yeah, because they want to pivot their image towards something more climate friendly. But the real independent venture groups are more focused on the fundamentals of your business than on the trends.
And I'll only add to that, that's 100% correct. The major oil and gas producers really are trying to become a little bit more focused on future sustainable energy programs, specifically clean tech. But their still main business is taking oil out of the ground or gas out of the ground and shipping it to you and putting it in your car. So you're not going to find you'll find a lot of lip service when it comes to doing clean tech or green tech, but you're not going to find a lot of actual dollars being spent on it relative to the other ability to make money in the energy space. That shouldn't discourage you. That should just tell you what the landscape is.
There's also a big difference in economy and willingness to pay for something which is too expensive sometimes. Think about it. The cost of gasoline here in Houston is $2.50 per gallon compared to $6 or $7 in Europe. I pay my electricity at 6 cents a kilowatt hour. You pay 30. So we are more focused on lower cost than on the good of the planet. That's a different mentality than in Europe.
And nobody here is saying that's right or that's the correct way of thinking. We're just telling you that's the way it is.
Yeah. And another complaint I hear a lot from, especially from VCs and private equity group, is that they would like to invest in projects which are climate or CO2 or energy transition, but there are not that many, and most of them are very small. And for private equity, it's not their field. They would like to see something is already 5 years and making a lot of money and making a lot of EBITDA, but those don't exist yet. Not in enough quantity, at least.
Yeah. Any other?
Catch 22 here.
You want to say something, Remco?
No, I said I feel a catch 22 here.
Yeah, but you have to realize that, for example, people come to Houston not for tourism or for anything else. People come to Houston to work and to make money.
That's
We are a
precisely
very
right.
simple organization, very simple mentality, but very functional and very profitable.
I always like to say the only reason anybody comes to Houston is 3 reasons. Love, because their spouse is involved with either the medical center or the energy space, or they're getting healed somehow. Obviously, best medical center on the entire planet. This is where, heads of state and everybody else comes for heart issues, cardiovascular, lung issues, and cancer obviously is the #1 thing we do very well here. And obviously oil. I mean, so there's really 3 reasons and that's it. Nobody stays in Houston because they love Houston. They stay in Houston because they love the people in Houston, which is easy to do. It's a beautiful, wonderful town.
Well said.
Well, I love Houston.
I do too.
Yeah, we also love Houston. Is there any more questions for our panelists?
I don't have a question. I would like to add something with regards to the renewable energies. What we do see here a lot is that the offshore wind sector, so the offshore wind farms and so forth, are growing exponentially right now. That's not particularly in Houston. We see that more on the East Coast, but there's a lot of companies in Houston that are very much involved with it, and a lot of Dutch companies in the Netherlands and Dutch companies with offices based in Houston that are very much involved in it. So Remco, if it is something that you have that has to do with the offshore wind sector, then please feel free to contact me and I can see what I can do.
Nikki, so something you need to keep in mind is that Texas is the state in the US where we make most electricity from wind. We've been investing in wind for the last 30, 40 years.
Right.
And probably something like 15 or 20% of all electricity in Texas comes from wind. Despite the fact that we have very cheap gas.
Right.
We've invested strategically in that for the last 30 years. One of the problems that we have is that there are not so many wind turbine manufacturers in the US. They are mostly coming from Europe. And they are very, very expensive. And we don't like expensive things.
Yes,
No.
but I think you are referring to the wind farms on land, not the offshore wind farms.
Mm-hmm. We have lots and lots of onshore. Texas has lots and lots of land, and in West Texas and North Texas, the landscape is ripe with wind. I mean, it really is a very significant amount of wind that we get, wind energy. It was a bit of a problem, obviously, when we had our cold snap last month. It was a very big situation. But you will find that while Texans do live and breathe oil and gas specifically and non-renewables, they really do care about the renewable energy space. And so it's not a complete zero when it comes to figuring out worlds and teams of building out renewable and clean tech businesses.
Yeah.
Just to answer Nikki there, we're not in wind energy. We're in reducing the carbon footprint by creating a new type of glare control.
Mm.
So we have glare control with media functionality. So it's segmented tintable glass that can create imagery with the daylight as the backlight. So it's the most sustainable digital out of home, or it's the first glare control with a media function.
Very clever.
To give you an idea, Remco and Nikki, about the mentality of the people here sometimes, I had a meeting with some friends and some people from the Texas Family Office Association last weekend, and we were talking about carbon. And one guy made a comment, why does everybody hate carbon? Is it because it's black and they are racist?
Yeah, I think renewable energy is actually the debate now in Texas, in the whole states, and for the next years and the future of Texas in their energy transition.
The city of Houston, for example, has a very comprehensive carbon capture plan, climate action plan.
Yeah.
They're all part of it. The Great Houston Partnership, which is the economic engine of the region here, has 3 or 4 different programs focusing on that also. But unless the larger companies are really making big investments, it's going to be slow transition.
Yeah.
So the big change is going to come from the big companies.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so I see
One more question, if I can. Mark mentioned that there was a green tech fund.
Greentown Labs.
Greentown Labs.
Greentown Labs?
Yeah, I'll find it and put it in there.
They're originally from Boston,
Mm-hmm.
and they opened their biggest branch here in Houston.
And
They're
they have
opening officially, cutting the ribbon next week.
and a beautiful facility right across the street from a very dense area of Houston called the Ion, which is housing a number of startups. It's really going to be fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
There it is. There's the link.
Yeah. Yeah, and they are very active as well, organizing events and other kind of informative sessions.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be on a panel with the lady from Greentown Labs next Tuesday. She's opening officially on Thursday, I think. And on Friday, the mayor is coming to visit Greentown Labs. So it's going to be a lot of events around it.
Yeah, definitely.
And are they not into carbon reduction?
They very much are.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, it's more of a private question here, but it would be wise to reach out to them.
100%.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, don't hesitate if you have other ideas like that, or you want to have more contacts. Both Arian, Mark, Maria, and I are pretty good networkers. We know a lot of people in the area, so don't hesitate to reach out. If we can make connections for you, more than happy.
Absolutely.
Thank you, will do.
Okay.
Yeah. If you have additional questions, we can always answer by email or by phone. We're always able to help you. Yes. So if there is no more question, I think we have a questions from Tim in the chat. How feasible is investments and setting up a facility for small manufacturing companies?
That's probably Ariane question, but I imagine it's relatively easy.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on whether it's for a brand new company or if it's for an established company. With 300,000 per month, that sounds like a pretty decent company if that's what they currently are earning here in the United States. I would say getting a facility for that is it just depends on going back to covenants, whether you can easily, with EBITDA, cover your charges with the debt. And then if that's the case, and you have some collateral such as accounts receivables and inventory, it is pretty feasible to set it up. Worst case scenario, some of the banks, what they can do is they can look at the Dutch entity as well, or look at a guarantee from a Dutch bank, worst case scenario, and come up with some kind of a creative solution to provide that working capital facility here in the United States for the subsidiary, something we do all the time.
Yeah, I have a client from the Holland who is in the dredging industry, and they had a facility here in close to Chicago, but they closed it and they moved to a new facility here in Houston. And they basically bought land, built a warehouse and an assembly plant to assemble some of the components coming from other parts of the US and some imported from Holland. Their revenue is around 450,000 to 500,000 per month. And they had absolutely no problem getting funding from the local bank with guarantee from the mother company, because they know that the people know their industry, they are involved in the industry, they have a track record. The people who are running it have been in the industry for 20 years, and they have reasonably good contracts in hand. So good perspective to repay the loan.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, Tim, for your question. There is no more questions at this point. Yeah, I want to thank you everyone for joining. In order to respect the time as well, I want to again thank you, Willie, thank you, Ariane, and thank you, Mark, for sharing your valuable knowledge and interesting presentations. Of course, if you have any more questions, you can always send it to us by email. We are happy to help you. We know that money and capital is not a very easy topic, but it's really necessary to all of you. So we want to support you every time in that area. I hope this was a successful and useful session for you and your business. You will receive all this information to your email, both the presentation and the video. And finally, I just want to share with you that we will have another interesting event on April 28th. It's going to be a Pitch and Connect event with Mark as well, that is present here, and also organized by the NBSO, the Consulate General in Miami, the Diplomatic Network, Creative Holland, and T-Squared Agency. So please stay tuned to our social media posts, because you will be able to hear the innovation of about 12 Dutch startups, some of them also present now in this meeting. So thank you, Remco. Thank you everyone for being with us. And yeah, have a great day, and let's keep in touch. If you have any questions, just let us know, and we will be happy to help you. And see you next time in our next and upcoming events.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye, Willy.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Doei doei.